Hi everybody. On the 5th of October 1962, the Beatles released their first UK single, Love Me Do, with P.S. I Love You on the B-side. So it's the 60th anniversary, and I wanted to commemorate that because it wasn't just a normal single release. This was a song that had a very checkered history. There was decisions made during the recording and the release of this that had ramifications for decades. And it's a song that we have 3 studio versions released, all of which have a different drummer. And it all kicked off with this little riff. One thing as an aside that I've always found incredible is that Love Me Do, the Beatles' first single, was released on the very same day as the very first James Bond film. So you've got the biggest phenomenon in 20th century music and one of the biggest things ever happened to in cinema, both launched on exactly the same day. I wonder if anybody went to see Dr. No on 5th of October 1962 and also picked up a copy of Love Me Do on the way to the cinema. That's somebody who had their finger on the pulse of the 1960s. Love Me Do is a song that was predominantly written by Paul McCartney, and he'd had it knocking about for quite a long time. But on the Beatles' first visit to the EMI studios on Abbey Road in London on 6th of June 1962, they recorded their first version of this. Now, they still had Pete Best on drums at this point. He still had a couple of months left with the band. But for many years, it was thought that this 6th of June session at EMI Studios was an audition for to get a contract with EMI. But Mark Lewison, the great Beatles historian, he uncovered definitive proof several years back that actually the Beatles had already been signed to EMI at this point. And so if it was an audition, it was really an audition for George Martin to get to know them and see what he felt about them. The story of how George Martin came to sign the Beatles is an absolutely fascinating one. And in the Tune In series of books, well, we've only got volume 1 still at the moment, the revelation about how George Martin came to have to sign the Beatles is the highlight of these books. And if you haven't read it, just do it. It is phenomenal. But anyway, he's proved that the Beatles were already signed to EMI at this point. So they did a recording on this day of Love Me Do with Pete Best on drums, and you can find that on the Anthology 1 album. And it's not particularly great. I don't think the Beatles they certainly weren't as confident with the song as they would become later on. And whilst it didn't directly lead to Pete Best's removal from the band, the, shall we say, erratic drumming on this version certainly didn't do him any favours and certainly didn't endear him to George Martin. Pete sort of went off into some sort of unusual shuffles partway through the song for no obvious reason, and it kind of spoils the rhythm of the song a bit. So on this day also, if you've got Anthology 1, the version of Besame Mucho that was recorded on that day is on Anthology 1 as well. So version 1 of the song, 6th of June 1962, Pete Best on drums. Ringo's still off playing with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes at this point. You can find it on Anthology 1, and also played that day, Besame Mucho from Anthology 1, P.S. I Love You, and Ask Me Why. The second version of the song was recorded on 4th of September 1962. By this time, Pete Best was gone, Ringo was in the band. He'd only been with the band for just over a couple of weeks at this point, so he was still very much finding his feet. But the Beatles flew down to London, and on this day, the plan was for them to record their debut single. George Martin's intention on this day predominantly was for them to record the Mitch Murray song, How Do You Do It? He wanted that to be their first single. The Beatles were not keen at all. They felt that it didn't suit their image, and they were worried about going back to Liverpool where they had this sort of rock and roll image, and having just released a song like How Do You Do It, which was very much a kind of a soft pop song. So they were reluctant to do it, but they did record it. And again, if you've got Anthology 1, the version that's on there is what was recorded on 4th of September 1962 with Ringo on drums. So they also recorded Love Me Do on that date, and George Martin's intention at that time was that this was going to be the B-side of the first single. But there was a problem that day, and it's one that kind of haunted Ringo's star for decades. George Martin was already feeling a little bit stung by what had happened with Pete Best in June, and here was another new drummer that he didn't know anything about. So he was on guard right from the start. So on this day, the Beatles were practicing Please Please Me, which is a song that they'd just written. Now, whether it was nerves for Ringo being the first time he performed in a studio, we don't know, but he probably tried to do a little bit too much on that version of Please Please Me, and he ended up making a bit of a mess of it. Almost unprecedented. Ringo hardly ever made a mess of anything on a Beatles recording. But the version of Please Please Me that they were recording that day was this mythical one that George Martin described as being a bit like a slow Roy Orbison song, where they were going, Please Please Me. And he made the call to the Beatles that they really needed to speed the song up and make it a bit more urgent. And that was a great decision, to be fair. It's just a shame that we've never got to hear that version. There were 3 more songs played that day, and from Mark Lewison's research based on Brian Epstein interviews and the book that he wrote, that's likely to be a brand new Paul song called Tip of My Tongue, Ask Me Why and P.S. I Love You, but we've never heard versions of those from this particular day. So the Beatles ended that day, 4th of September, with full recordings of How Do You Do It and Love Me Do, and George Martin's intention was that they were going to be the A and B side of the Beatles' first single. But it all went pear-shaped over the next couple of days. A company called Ardmore Beechwood, which was the publishing arm of EMI, they were very, very instrumental in getting the Beatles signed to EMI in the first place. They were very keen on publishing rights to Lennon and McCartney songs. And when they heard that George Martin's plan for the Beatles' first single was to have a song that wasn't a Lennon and McCartney song, it was written by Mitch Murray, they were not happy at all and they put the foot down. So George Martin then looked at switching that so that How Do You Do It was the B-side and Love Me Do was the A-side. That plan was put to Mitch Murray, the writer of How Do You Do It, and he was not having that at all. He could see that there was a great hit record for How Do You Do It, and he was right, because Jerry and the Pacemakers had a smash #1 with it not too long afterwards. He refused to let How Do You Do It be the B-side because he didn't want it buried there. So How Do You Do It wasn't allowed to be the A-side by Ardmore Beechwood, and wasn't allowed to be the B-side by its writer Mitch Murray, so it had to be ditched altogether, much to the Beatles' relief. So George Martin decided that Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You would be the A and the B-side, but he wasn't particularly convinced by the version that they'd recorded on the 4th of September. So by the 11th of September, all this had happened and the Beatles were back down at EMI Studios in London to record the song again. When they got to London, they were in for a nasty shock, or Ringo was in particular, because George Martin had hired a session drummer, presumably because of what Ringo had done on Please Please Me, where he'd just kind of made a mess of it. So George Martin had brought in Andy White. Now, bringing in a session musician to replace one of the band members wasn't a particularly unusual thing to happen in the early 1960s. But it was a decision that Ringo did not like at all, and it did strain relations between him and George Martin for decades. Ringo never let George Martin forget that you wouldn't let me play on the first single. But anyway, they recorded Love Me Do on the 11th of September, and Ringo was allowed to play tambourines. So they also re-recorded P.S. I Love You, again with Andy Wright on drums, Ringo this time playing maracas. And that's the version that you get as the B-side to the Love Me Do single. They also recorded Please Please Me again this day. And again, it's Andy White on drums. And if you've got Anthology 1, that's the version with Andy White on drums that you'll find on there. So the Beatles finished the 11th of September with brand new recordings of Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You. And the single was prepared. Now, George Martin can't have been too unhappy with the version that was recorded with Ringo on drums the week before, because this was the version that ended up getting released. So on the 5th of October 1962, when the Beatles' first single hit the shelves, it was the Ringo version that was on these first pressings of the single. And you can identify that it's on a red label Parlophone. So where else will you find Ringo's version of Love Me Do? Well, any version of Past Masters that has been released from 1987 onwards will have Ringo's version with him on drums. That also includes the Mono Masters that came out in the Mono box set on CD in 2009 and then on vinyl from 2014. Also, there was an album called Rarities, which was issued in the United States in 1980. On that, you will find Ringo's version of Love Me Do, and also the original Canadian single issued in 1963. That was Ringo's version as well. So what about Andy White's version recorded on the 11th of September? So, as I said, the first pressings of the Love Me Do single on the Red Parlophone label, that had Ringo's version. But when it was repressed later, presumably following the success of the Beatles and they needed to print more copies, they switched to Andy White's version. So if you got that on a black Parlophone label issued in 1963, that is the Andy White version. Also, every version of Please Please Me that has been released contains the Andy White version. Same for P.S. I Love You. So of all the songs that are on here, there are 2 that Ringo doesn't appear on because it's the Andy White versions of Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You that made the way onto here. Also, the Beatles' Hits EP that was released in September 1963, that's got the Andy White version on. Before the Beatles went huge in America from February 64 onwards, they did have an album called Introducing the Beatles released in January 1964. That contains the Andy White version of Love Me Do. And also, when it was released on single in the US in April 1964, on the Tolly label through VJ Records, again they used the Andy White version. And then in 1973, when the Beatles' Red and Blue albums were issued, on the Red 1962-66 album, again, it's Andy White's version that you find on there. So here's my handy overview of who appeared on what and when. So if you want to get fixed in your brain which versions you will find Ringo on and which versions you'll find Andy White on and when each was recorded, hopefully this will help you. There was also something else during the release of Love Me Do that had consequences for decades. So during the middle of 1962, John and Paul put legally into writing their arrangement that they'd already had for a few years, where any song that either of them wrote would be credited as Lennon and McCartney. That was put into a legal document. There was also another sort of informal arrangement made at that time that didn't make it into the legal document, that whoever was the main writer of the song would have their name first. So if John wrote it, it would be Lennon and McCartney. If Paul was the main writer, it would be McCartney and Lennon. That information was given to the record company, but they didn't heed it, and the single came out credited to Lennon and McCartney. And that's how it always stayed. And I think this rankled with Paul for a long time, and eventually, when he released the Back in the US and Back in the World albums in 2002, he decided that he was going to reverse that, and the songs on these albums, the Beatles songs, are credited as being written by Paul McCartney and John Lennon, and that caused quite a hoo-ha back then 20 years ago, with Paul deciding to put his name first. And it was even causing trouble 50 years later when EMI decided to release a 50th anniversary repressing of the single Love Me Do with P.S. I Love You on the B-side. And what did they do? They pressed it with the Andy White version. So the release was delayed, they had to repress it with Ringo's version on, and consequently it didn't get released until the back end of October instead of early October to commemorate the anniversary. So happy 60th birthday to the release of Love Me Do, as we now enter the 60th anniversary of Beatles releases, while we've still got the 50th anniversary ongoing of the later career. I'm looking at how I want to commemorate some 60th anniversaries in videos on this channel, so if you're interested in that, if you haven't done already, please hit that subscribe button. Let me know your thoughts on Love Me Do, because I know it's not a lot of people's favourite Beatles song, but it's a song that I've always had a special place for in here. And thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again very soon. Bye.